propaganda that seeks to undermine democratic values and norms across Eastern and Central Europe. We've had the absolute pleasure of working with Vox Ukraine for a number of years as they consistently and tirelessly work towards our mutual goals. And we feel that working with Vox Ukraine, as well as the other SSRI partners, is absolutely imperative, as it allows us to reflect upon our own individual biases and attitudes and work towards challenging many of the assumptions that are implicit in this work. And to pursue these sort of ends, our approach, in which the propaganda diaries absolutely feeds into, acknowledges the multiple overlapping levels of influence that affect decision-making, including, political, social, cultural, economic, and environmental influences. And we know that people have an incredibly emotional relationship with democracy and the truth, going with gut feelings, as well as these multiple levels of influences to make decisions about what the truth is. And we have to say, that's why Vox Ukraine's work is absolutely so important. Utilizing their propaganda diary database as a comprehensive catalog that shows the trends and topics and targets of disinformation, we can analyze and understand this problem to a greater extent. For instance, we can analyze how seemingly outlandish conspiracy theories capitalize on emotions and cultural norms to take root in societies. Additionally, we can see how these narratives are pervasive and know absolutely no borders throughout the region. For our work, this allows us to communicate with organizations and policy and decision makers throughout the region to discuss best practices and develop a strategic plan for countering these narratives, rather than one-to-one debunking efforts that, while remain important, are not the sole solution to this pervasive issue. Lastly, I'd just like to mention that the monitoring and analysis created by Vox allows the SSRI team to generate content that reaches the most vulnerable. Those audiences that we would most like to reach find traditional news content or debunking content to be overwhelming, depressing, oftentimes elitist, and very politically charged, and therefore have a tendency to avoid it altogether, believing that they can spot fakes on their own. By analyzing the emotions that are undermining, or that underlie these values, I should say, the SSRI team is able to create, podcasts, short form videos, social media posts, and even interactive gamification style content to reach people where they already are. And that would not be possible without the fantastic analysis that's being done through this project. I'm sure I could go on and talk of an additional multitude of reasons why the work of Vox Ukraine and specifically this project have benefited both DTI and the SSRI project. But I guess I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot. Ми тоді перейдемо до пані Світлани і перейдемо від загальної.
We will probably switch to Ms. Svetlana to some specific research. What were your research and what was the result of your research? Something that we can tell the public about. Well, the work on the disinformation of Russia in Ukraine was started by our team back in 2021, way before the beginning of the full-scale invasion. We analyzed the spreading of Russian misinformation in Italy and Germany, and those were the countries which were mostly targeted by Russian propaganda. But in 2022, we added four more countries to our monitoring: Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland. And thus now we present the database which has the analysis of 6 countries of Europe. Generally, within the last year of monitoring, starting from the 24th February 2022 to 24th February 2023, we registered almost 5,000 cases of misinformation in all those countries, all those 6 countries. I mean, the news that have some manipulation by Russia, those news were classified as fakes by groups, and so the groups within which certain number of fakes may circulate, and we segregated 325 narratives which with which Russia targets those countries. So we generalized the topics that Russia uses in their rhetorics to prove that, first of all, Ukraine is a failed state, as they call it, is the narrative which was exploited by Russia within years and years, and which is more actual for Russian propaganda within the last year, is to justify their armed aggression. We have 27 such narratives, and they were the narratives that could be seen in our propaganda diary database. You can check every narrative, every fake, every media where those cases and fakes were circulating in. You can check it in different languages, what was going on in different countries. So the database is available in 9 languages. Not only Ukrainians can use it, but also everybody who speaks English, and the representatives of all the countries which we were focusing on. I won't focus on the details, how to use the base, what can be found there, but I propose to check out the video which was prepared by our team, and it tells you in detail how to use the database, how to download that data, and how to use the search function. So please, video on the screen. As you could see, our database has an incalculable number of fakes that can be worked with. I think this instrument may be useful for the journalists, specifically for those who work with the foreign sources, to identify, as we showed in the black and white list of media, which sources of information are transparent and factological, and why are dangerous, to understand which topics are sensitive to Russian propaganda and which ones can be more neutral. So what should be worked with in a more cautious manner. Also, this database fits for the researchers, so you can download it and make your analysis by the keywords. And talking about the general trends, as you could see from the video, within the month when Russian propaganda was most active in Europe, they were December 22 and January 23. But the dynamics of Russian propaganda depends both in Europe and Ukraine on what is going on in the international arena, in the world, in the economy, in Ukraine. So the period of mass strikes on the energy infrastructure was the moment of the peak load on our media environment. In the same way, all the news from the front, from international arena, from any international platforms about any international agreements, they may be accompanied by the waves of misinformation. So I urge everybody who wants to check out those narratives in our database, the most sensitive ones. Russian propaganda is not very industrious, I have to say. The most popular topic remains accusation of Ukraine in Nazism, and another absurd topic about the biological laboratories of United States located in Ukraine. So it's surprising that the most absurd narratives are most popular in Europe. So you can find it at Russian disinfo.vox.org and in our social networks, Facebook, Telegram, you can find a link to this database, one of the latest articles, and the video about how to use it, and also the analytics about what was going on with Russian propaganda within the last year in the countries of Europe that we were analyzing. What have you been impressed with personally? What are your personal conclusions about what you've seen through this research? In our opinion, before we started analyzing all those 6 countries of Europe, the countries where Russian propaganda should be flourishing best should be Germany and Italy, just like it was during the COVID-19 pandemics. But our analysis proved that the country which was mostly targeted by Russian propaganda was Poland. We documented almost a quarter of all the disinformation cases in that country, and the most sources of misinformation were identified there. So Poland turned out to be mostly vulnerable to Russian disinformation, or saturated with Russian misinformation. It may be related to the huge inflow of Ukrainian refugees to Poland and the sensitivity to Ukrainian topic, and Germany and Italy took the lowest places in this rating. So to counter such a barrage of misinformation that Russia spreads not only for Russian audience or Ukrainian audience, but also for a multi-million European audience, the presence of Ukraine in the information field of Europe should be increased. Now that we're talking about 1,000 cases, targeting all of them on a case-by-case basis wouldn't be very effective, and debunking them would be less efficient. So for the journalists, for the government, for the NGOs and different media and bloggers and regular Ukrainians, it's important to counter the narratives. The narratives are less multiple, and we can counter them group by group. It's 27 of them in our analysis, but we admit that the number can be bigger, and new ones may emerge depending on the situation in the world or in the front lines. So we may develop counter narratives and create the positive image of Ukraine, creation of image of Ukraine as a non-corrupted state, the strong state, the state that implements the reforms and which is capable of winning this war. That could be the response to the key, most widespread and the strongest narratives of Russian propaganda that circulate in Europe. You already answered it in part, but my personal question is, how can you win over the misinformation? Do we have enough literacy? Do we need to implement some new legislation in the media, including in European countries? How to win this dragon? I would say that the most efficient are the strictest methods, the ones that were used in Ukraine, the shutdown of the open sources of misinformation, such as restrictions of the online media, the shutdown of TV channels, the restriction of social networks, like it happened with Odnoklassniki and Vkontakte. And if we see that those measures were efficient in Ukraine, for Europe, the switch to such a legislative policy can be perceived as the limitation of freedom of speech, and we can continue hearing it for years ahead. So to add something to what I said earlier, what we can do is we can explain why Russian misinformation is dangerous, how it may harm the state, how it may harm separate social groups or some specific people, how it can harm their lives and become a threat to their health. We can tell the people how misinformation violates the human rights, and this is how can we push the regulators to implement a new legislation. Good afternoon, Irina Litvinenko, Ukrinform. You mentioned that the site is available in 9 languages, but do you promote this research in those countries that were the countries of your focus? And if so, in what way are you doing it? And another question is this study still going on, and are you going to add more countries and maybe the ones outside Europe to your research? Yes, our research will be continuing. We are going to update the database twice, maybe once in summer and once in autumn, and we will add more cases in those 6 countries of our focus. As to the new countries, we don't yet have agreement among our colleagues whether it's necessary to add more countries, so we will keep focusing on those 6 ones. I would also add that You versus Disinfo, which is a part of Euro Commission, they also monitor this disinformation effort in Europe. Misinformation is spread all across European Union, so based on their previous achievements, we took the decision which countries should we focus on before we start this profound work. And as to your first question, please remind me. Well, yes, the promotion in coordination with our colleagues from DT Institute, we engage European Value Center to our effort. They are represented with the Project Kremlin Watchers in the countries of our focus, and they use the results of our monitoring to develop the recommendations as to the policy for countering this disinformation, misinformation. And also our project involves Internews of Ukraine, who create counter narratives, and it's not about debunking, but they spread the narratives about what is really going on about this or that subject, so they target both Ukrainian audience and audiences of other countries. And as to our presentations, we will share it with the fact-checker, international fact-checkers networks, and there is the representation of fact-checkers from many countries, not only countries of our focus. We also want to share our research with the colleagues from National Democratic Institute and Misinformation Hub, which is a part of this institute, which includes other fact-checkers from Ukraine and other countries as well.
Chris Sampson, National Security Media. I have a few questions. Let's go through a few of them. So what responses have you seen that are effective? For instance, there is debate whether fact-checking alone or media literacy is effective. And do you see certain sectors that some techniques are good at but don't work in others, like policymakers versus journalists or educational? So we'll start with that, and then I have a few more, but let's just start with that one.
Дякую за ваше питання. На нашу
Thank you for your question. In our opinion, among the methods, generally among the capabilities to counter misinformation, fact-checking it's still there. It should be there. The debunking should be going on. Unfortunately, it's impossible to debunk like thousands of myths, but maybe the most prominent ones. And within the last year, one of the most viral fakes for our team was a group of Russian messages about Bucha in Kyiv region. Those were the most sensitive and strong fakes that we had to debunk in a mandatory manner. As to the other measures, the problem of misinformation, specifically in the European countries of our focus, the problem is in absence of policy makers. In fact, our colleagues in this project from European Value Center, they prepare the policy briefs for policy makers. Anyway, the level of their engagement remains low. The reaction to misinformation threats remains very weak. And in our opinion, a good method in future, in the closest future, would be establishing the dialogue with the policy makers within some panel discussions, round tables, conferences, any type of format where we can speak with the policymakers directly and to communicate the threat, the real threat of misinformation and what can be done about it. As to the education, it's obviously the element that goes neck and neck with the previous one. It's impossible without the development of the critical thinking of the population. We should promote fact-checking because it won't be otherwise perceived. We should promote the access to the checked, the verified sources of information, because people will rather orient not at truth but at what they like, and this is where we should include the component of education, the critical thinking and media literacy. So I would say that it should be the synergy of all the methods that should be working, and the most urgent is the dialogue with policymakers by all means.
Would be, for instance, you have 6 countries you've looked at now, and you're talking about expanding, which is good. One of the methods my team uses, and I would like to see what you guys are doing, is do you assess target audiences that the Russians are really, really determined to convince? So let's say Poland was a good example you just gave. Are there some of those that you see like a lot of activity, even if we're not understanding the return for their time, but do you see some that like we can tell from the data alone that Russia really, really wants this one, but is not concerned with this one? Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah.
Дякую за це питання. Щодо аудиторії, то
Thank you for this question. As to the audience, I would say that the audience of Russian misinformation in the countries of our focus should not have grown, and it can be seen from sociological questioning. I cannot give you the exact figures, but from the latest data, the part of the European population or separate countries of the European Union, by the way, there is the same trend in the United States, the fraction of those who are eager to continue to support Ukraine does not decrease. For me, it's an indicator that Russian propaganda does not work, indicator that Russia has not justified its aggression and has not undermined the image of Ukraine in Europe. Obviously, there are some groups of population in every country that have not some pro-Russian outlook, but they just have sentiment to some narratives. It may be related to some of their personal histories or their attitude to what's going on in Ukraine or around the world. There is some fraction of disinterested people who has no, and that's quite sensitive audience, which can be pulled to one group or another, and that's quite a dangerous trend if Russia will be able to pull them to their side rather than to have those people rely on verified sources of information. If they end up under the influence of Russian narratives, it may further undermine the trust to Ukraine in general and to undermine the support of Ukraine. And obviously what Russia can try to reach, what they want to target, is the change of the election preferences. In every country there are representatives of politicum who have anti-Ukrainian, anti-Western sentiment, given they are the European countries. Meanwhile, they have some anti-democratic, anti-Western sentiment, and the support of vitality of these narratives for that audience, for those who support the pro-Russian forces, is the type of influence on the election preferences. So people would rather support those politicians who promote that is advantages to Russia in every separate country. It's some indirect interference of Russia into the democratic processes going on in the countries of Europe. It's worth mentioning, obviously. It may be difficult to prove, to corroborate this influence on the election preferences, but there is indirect influence anyway.
1,000 questions for you because it's my area of specialty. One final question for today would be, when you're dealing with policymakers or journalists in these, do you go beyond what the narrative is to discuss what I call the underlying objective would be? So the two examples when I teach about disinformation in the last year, I say the reason why they mention Nazis is to keep you from wanting to help. The reason why they mention nukes and nuclear attacks is to keep you from wanting to help. So when there's a narrative, it's adjoined to an objective. There's a desired objective. And sometimes when I see long lists of narratives, I don't know that the reader of those understands what is the desired behavior change, modification. So do you help policymakers with that?
Наразі ми ще не працювали з полісі, саме наша організація ще не працювала з полісімейкерами у Європі, але це один із наших важливих наступних кроків, зокрема із нашими партнерами із
Well, it's one of our important parts of our cooperation with our international colleagues. The direct dialogue with the policymakers would be the establishment of the online conferences and then to switch to offline mode, and the direct dialogue would be something that may change the view of the policymakers, draw their attention, and to let them know that they are amid the misinformation. And I want to add then how to convince them that this misinformation is not the activity of separate groups, it's not some patriotic or volunteer call, and it's the Russian policy which is coordinated and financed by the government. How can we corroborate that? Well, based on our research, we cannot assert that all those blacklisted media are financed by Russia, but we can, for the beginning, we can show the narrative connections. For example, what Russia Today, Sputnik write about the state-financed Russian media, who we know for sure are under control of Kremlin, and how their news overlap those that are documented by us. And then why should it influence the policymakers is the explanation of the real threats of misinformation. If, for example, through misinformation messages, Russia makes the people use the green corridors that can be organized by the occupiers, that people may be harmed, or to betray the state by putting their lives under threats, anything that can put the lives and health of the people in jeopardy, that should be an important lever, that should be something that politicians should be concerned about. And again, the matter of political preferences, the election system, it's something that may end up under threat too. They can do nothing, but they may understand that there is the country from outside that interferes the lives of their citizens and their support within the existing political system.
I do have one more. Has your organization or ones that you're working with engaged in machine learning for some of the narratives? using AI or machine learning?
Ми ще не використовували AI і machine learning, але дякую за питання, бо паралельно
Thank you for this question. In parallel, we develop another project which is aimed at analyzing the cases of Russian misinformation from Telegram. And thanks to the artificial intelligence, they will be sorted by narratives. Like they may sort which message contains part of misinformation and which narrative it can be sorted to. I cannot say when this project would be implemented, but we understand that the artificial intelligence is something that is very important. It's an important instrument for fact checkers. For example, Meta uses the fact checking, the verified information to appear in the most posts online, so why don't we integrate the AI in our work? As to the Russian misinformation, we didn't implement the AI so far, but thank you for this idea. Well, we can continue talking about Google too. Thank you very much. Joining us was Fact Check, and we were talking about Russian misinformation in Europe and how to counter it further on, and we'll continue tomorrow. See you shortly.